The deck was burning beneath my feet, orange flames licking at the twisted steel where our flight deck had buckled and torn. Black smoke billowed into the tropical sky, carrying with it the acrid smell of aviation fuel and something else, something I didn't want to think about. But through that choking haze, I could still hear them. The distant drone of Hellcat engines, growing fainter as our air group pressed their attack against the Japanese fleet. Our ship was dying, but our boys were still in the fight. And by God, we were going to make sure they had everything they needed to finish the job. My name is Lieutenant Commander Robert McPherson, and I was the air group commander aboard USS Princeton on October 24, 1944, the day we learned that victory sometimes comes at a price that breaks your heart even as it fills you with pride. The Philippine Sea stretched endlessly in every direction that morning, its surface painted gold by the rising sun. I stood on Princeton's flight deck, watching my pilots make their final preparations. The light carrier, we called her Sweet Pea, cut through the gentle swells with the rest of Task Group 38.3, part of Admiral Halsey's massive Third Fleet. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the largest naval battle in history was about to unfold. Skipper, called Lieutenant Jimmy Morrison, my wingman and one of the finest pilots I'd ever known. Looks like we're finally going to get our shot at the fleet. I nodded, checking my watch. It was 0530 hours, and the first reports were already coming in from our search planes. Admiral Ozawa's Northern Force, 4 aircraft carriers and their escorts, had been spotted approximately 200 miles northeast of our position. It was the bait in what we would later learn was an elaborate Japanese trap, but at the time, it looked like the chance we'd been waiting for. A decisive carrier versus carrier engagement that could cripple Japanese naval aviation once and for all. The Princeton displaced just over 11,000 tons and carried about 45 aircraft, a mix of F6F Hellcats, SB2C Helldivers, and TBF Avengers. We weren't one of the big fleet carriers like Essex or Lexington, but we were fast, nimble, and our air group was as good as any in the Pacific. Captain William Bureker had been drilling us relentlessly for months, and it showed in everything from our launch procedures to our combat formations. All pilots report to ready rooms, the ship's speaker crackled to life. This is not a drill. Repeat, all pilots report to ready rooms immediately. The briefing was quick and to the point. Intelligence indicated that the Japanese carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda were operating with minimal air cover. Most of their experienced pilots had been ground down in months of brutal fighting, and their replacement pilots were green and inexperienced. Our job was to launch a massive coordinated strike with the other carriers in Task Group 38.3, hit them hard, and send what remained of the Japanese carrier force to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Remember, I told my pilots as we gathered on the flight deck, these are the same carriers that hit Pearl Harbor. Zuikaku was there when they started this war. Today, we finish it. The first launch began at 0800 hours. One by one, our Hellcats roared down Princeton's deck and lifted into the clear morning sky. I was flying F6F to 5 Bureau number 70,143, a bird I'd grown attached to over the past 6 months. She was painted in the standard navy blue with white markings, and her 6.50 caliber machine guns had never let me down. As we formed up and headed northeast toward the enemy fleet, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd come. 3 years ago, the Japanese Navy had seemed invincible, their pilots were experienced, their equipment was first-rate, and their tactics were innovative. But month by month, battle by battle, we'd learned their weaknesses and exploited them. Now, as we approached what would become known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the tables had turned completely. Our strike group consisted of 12 Hellcats, 8 Helldivers, and 6 Avengers, a modest force compared to what the big carriers could put up, but deadly in the right hands. The flight northeast took just over an hour, and as we closed on the reported position of the Japanese fleet, the radio chatter picked up. Tally ho! Tally ho! 4 carriers, bearing 040, distance 12 miles. There they were, spread out in a loose formation with their escorts arranged in defensive screens around them. Even from 15,000 feet, I could see that these weren't the powerful task forces that had terrorized the Pacific in 1942. The carriers looked worn, their flight decks nearly empty of aircraft. Intelligence had been right. Most of their planes were already committed to supporting land-based operations in the Philippines. "Princeton, strike, leader to all aircraft," I called over the radio. "We're going after the big one, that's Zuikaku. Hellcats will go in first and suppress any fighter opposition. Helldivers and Avengers, wait for my signal, then make your runs from different angles. Let's make this count." The Japanese had maybe 20 fighters in the air, a pitiful combat air patrol compared to what they should have had defending 4 carriers. Our Hellcats tore through them like a hot knife through butter. Lieutenant Morrison flamed a 0 with a beautiful deflection shot, and I watched 2 more Japanese fighters spiral into the sea under the guns of my squadron mates. But as we pressed our attack, something felt wrong. There were too few fighters, too few ships, and the whole formation seemed hollow. It would be hours before we learned the truth. This was indeed a decoy force, designed to draw Halsey's carriers north while the main Japanese battle fleet slipped through San Bernardino Strait to attack our invasion forces at Leyte. At the time, though, all I cared about was the target in front of me. Zuikaku, Pearl Harbor's revenge, was directly below us, her flight deck turned into the wind as she desperately tried to launch what few aircraft she had left. "Helldivers, this is strike leader. Go in now. Repeat, go in now." The SB2C Helldivers rolled over into their attack dives, plummeting toward the carrier at nearly vertical angles. I watched the first 1,000-pound bomb hit just aft of Zuikaku's Sisland, sending up a massive column of smoke and flame. A second bomb punched through the flight deck near the bow, and suddenly the proud carrier that had helped start this war was wreathed in fire. Our Avengers came in low and fast, their Mark 13 torpedoes aimed at Zuikaku's waterline. The first fish missed, but the second and third found their mark. Through my binoculars, I could see the carrier listing heavily to port, her speed dropping as damage control parties fought to keep her afloat. The flight back to Princeton should have been a victory lap. We'd struck a blow against the Japanese fleet, and early reports suggested that our coordinated attacks were devastating the enemy carriers. Zuikaku was clearly doomed, and smoke columns on the horizon indicated that our escorts were taking a beating as well. But as we approached Task Group 38.3, something was wrong. Where Princeton should have been steaming in formation with our escort destroyers, there was only smoke, thick, black smoke that rose like a funeral pyre against the brilliant blue sky. "Princeton Strike Group, this is Birmingham," came a voice over the radio. "Do not approach the task group. Repeat, do not approach. Princeton has been hit and is burning. You are directed to land aboard Lexington." My heart sank. In the 2 hours we'd been away striking the Japanese fleet, our own ship had somehow been attacked. As we got closer, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Princeton was dead in the water, her flight deck twisted and burning, her superstructure wreathed in flames. The light cruiser Birmingham was alongside, playing high-pressure hoses onto the fires, while destroyers Morrison, Irwin, and Cassing Young formed a protective screen around the stricken carrier. Whispered Lieutenant Morrison over the radio. What happened to her? We would learn the details later, but the basic facts were as shocking as they were tragic. While we'd been attacking Admiral Ozawa's decoy force, the Japanese had been launching their own strikes from land bases in the Philippines. A single Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber had somehow penetrated our combat air patrol and put a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb right through Princeton's flight deck. Under normal circumstances, a single bomb shouldn't have been enough to doom a carrier. But this bomb had punched through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar, where 6 fully fueled and armed Avengers were spotted for the next launch. The resulting explosion had blown a hole in the flight deck 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, ignited massive fires throughout the ship, and killed or wounded dozens of sailors in the hangar bay. As we circled overhead, waiting for clearance to land on Lexington, I watched the tiny figures of Princeton's crew fighting desperately to save their ship. Damage control parties were working in conditions that would have broken lesser men, temperatures over 1,000 degrees, smoke so thick you couldn't see 3 feet, and the constant threat of secondary explosions as aviation fuel and ammunition cooked off in the fires. What I couldn't see from 5,000 feet was the incredible story of courage and sacrifice was unfolding on Princeton's decks. Later, when I interviewed survivors, I learned details that still give me chills. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Boats O'Malley was in the hangar bay when the bomb hit. A 20-year Navy veteran from Boston, Boats had seen action from the Coral Sea to the Philippine Sea, and he knew ships like other men knew their wives. When that 500-pound bomb detonated among the parked Avengers, he was thrown 30 feet across the deck and should have been killed instantly. Instead, he picked himself up, assessed the situation in seconds, and started organizing the surviving hangar deck crew. "You men!" he shouted over the roar of flames and the screaming of twisted metal. "We've got ordnance cooking off in here. Get those hoses flowing and start moving the wounded topside." The heat in the hangar was beyond description. Aviation fuel was burning in rivers across the deck, and ammunition was exploding every few seconds. But Boats and his men stayed at their posts, fighting fires and rescuing wounded shipmates even as the steel deck plates became too hot to touch. Seaman First Class Tommy Rodriguez, just 19 years old and on his first combat cruise, found himself trapped behind a wall of flames with 3 badly wounded sailors. Instead of abandoning them, he soaked his dungarees with seawater, wrapped the wounded men in wet blankets, and carried them one by one through 50 feet of burning fuel to safety. "I wasn't being brave," Rodriguez told me months later, his hands still bearing the scars from that day. "I was scared out of my mind. But those were my shipmates, you know? You don't leave your shipmates." Meanwhile, on the bridge, Captain Buerker was fighting his own battle to save the ship. With main power lost and communications knocked out, he was coordinating damage control efforts by sending runners throughout the ship. The bridge itself was filling with smoke, and the intense heat from the hangar fires was making the steel bulkheads too hot to touch. Captain called his executive officer, Commander John Hoskins. "We're getting reports of ammunition exploding in the hangar. The magazines might go next." Buerker considered the situation for perhaps 10 seconds that must have felt like hours. Princeton was his command, his responsibility, and abandoning her would be the hardest thing he'd ever done. But he also had 1,400 men under his command, and their lives mattered more than any ship. "Pass the word," he said quietly. "Prepare to abandon ship. But keep the damage control parties working as long as possible. We're not giving up yet." While our burning ship fought for her life, something remarkable was happening 200 miles to the north. Our strike against Admiral Ozawa's carriers was succeeding beyond our wildest expectations, and the reports filtering back to the task group painted a picture of absolute devastation. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, was going down with most of her aircraft still trapped in her hangars. Zuiho had taken multiple bomb hits and was listing heavily to starboard. Chitose was already beneath the waves, victim of a coordinated torpedo attack by Lexington's air group. And Chiyoda, smallest of the Japanese carriers, was dead in the water and burning from stem to stern. But the real measure of our victory wasn't just in ships sunk. It was in the complete destruction of what remained of Japanese carrier aviation. In the space of a few hours, we had eliminated over 100 Japanese aircraft and their irreplaceable pilots. The few planes that managed to get airborne were shot down by our combat air patrol or destroyed when their carriers were hit. This was the end of the Japanese carrier forces, an effective fighting unit. Never again would they be able to challenge American naval supremacy in the Pacific. It was a victory that would be remembered alongside Midway and the Philippine Sea, except that our own ship was burning as the battle reached its climax. I finally got clearance to land aboard Lexington at 14:45 hours, nearly 6 hours after we'd launched from Princeton that morning. As my Hellcat caught the number 3 wire and jerked to a stop, I could see Princeton burning in the distance, still surrounded by rescue ships but clearly doomed. The debrief was short and bittersweet. Yes, we'd accomplished our mission. Yes, the Japanese carrier force was finished. But Princeton, our home, our base, our floating piece of America, was dying, and there wasn't a thing we could do about it. At 15:23 hours, while Birmingham was still alongside fighting Princeton's fires, the inevitable happened. The flames finally reached the carrier's bomb magazine, and 3,400 tons of explosives detonated in a blast that could be heard 30 miles away. I was on Lexington's flight deck when it happened, watching through binoculars as rescue operations continued. 1 second, Princeton was there, burning but still fighting. The next second, she was hidden in a column of smoke and flame that rose 2,000 feet into the air. When the smoke cleared, Princeton's entire stern section was gone. Just gone. The explosion had literally blown away everything after the island, leaving only a 400-foot section of twisted wreckage that rolled over and sank within minutes. But the explosion did more than destroy Princeton. Birmingham, the cruiser that had been alongside fighting fires and rescuing survivors, took the full force of the blast on her superstructure. Flying debris, some pieces weighing several tons, crashed down onto Birmingham's decks, killing 229 sailors and wounding another 420. It was a tragedy that compounded tragedy, but it also demonstrated something fundamental about the American fighting spirit. Even as their own ship was being torn apart by flying wreckage, Birmingham's crew continued their rescue efforts. Boats were lowered to pick up Princeton survivors from the water. Medical teams worked frantically to save wounded shipmates, and damage control parties fought fires on their own ship while simultaneously trying to help the men they'd been trying to save. Captain Thomas Inglis of Birmingham summed it up in his after-action report. The loss of Princeton was a severe blow to the task group, but the courage displayed by both crews, Princeton's men fighting to save their ship and Birmingham's men fighting to save Princeton's crew, exemplified the finest traditions of the United States Navy. Of Princeton's crew of approximately 1,400 men, we lost 108 killed and 190 wounded, casualties that were remarkably light considering the violence of the explosion that destroyed the ship. The low casualty count was a testament to the crew's training, discipline, and plain old-fashioned courage under fire. Boats O'Malley, the chief petty officer who had organized hangar deck evacuations, was among the survivors picked up by Birmingham. When I met him 3 days later aboard Lexington, his hands were wrapped in bandages and his eyebrows were singed off, but he was already asking when he could get back to sea. "Skipper," he told me, "that was a good ship. One of the best I ever served on. But ships can be replaced. The important thing is that we got most of the boys out, and we gave those carriers hell before we lost her." Seaman Rodriguez, the 19-year-old who had carried 3 wounded shipmates through burning fuel, was recommended for the Silver Star. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged. "Anybody would have done the same thing, sir. That's what we're here for." Captain Bjerker went down with his ship in the best tradition of the Navy. He was last seen on Princeton's bridge, helping to coordinate the final evacuation efforts, even as the fires closed in around him. His body was never recovered, but his leadership in Princeton's final hours saved hundreds of lives. As the sun set on October 24, 1944, the scope of what had happened began to become clear. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, was far from over, but the carrier action off Cape Engano had achieved everything we could have hoped for and more. Admiral Ozawa's northern force was in ruins. All 4 Japanese carriers were either sunk or sinking. Their escorts, light cruisers and destroyers that Japan could ill afford to lose, were scattered and running for home. Most importantly, the cream of what remained of Japanese naval aviation had been wiped out. Pilots who had taken years to train and could never be replaced were now on the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The strategic implications were enormous. Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations was finished. Their naval air arm, which had dominated the Pacific for the first year of the war, was now reduced to land-based squadrons flying obsolete aircraft with inexperienced pilots. But the victory had come at a cost. Princeton was gone, along with 108 good men who would never see home again. Birmingham was badly damaged and would spend months in repair yards. And those of us in Princeton's air group were now orphans, our floating home reduced to scattered wreckage on the ocean floor. 3 weeks later, I was aboard the new carrier Shangri-La, getting ready to participate in the final operations against Japan. By then, the full scope of the Leyte Gulf victory was clear. We hadn't just defeated a Japanese task force, we had effectively ended Japanese naval aviation as a strategic threat. But I kept thinking about Princeton and about the men who died trying to save her. In war, victory and tragedy are often separated by the thickness of a steel bulkhead or the accuracy of a single bomb. We had accomplished our mission that day. The Japanese carriers were destroyed, their air groups eliminated, and their ability to threaten American operations in the Pacific was broken forever. Yet Princeton was gone, taking with her 108 American sailors whose only crime was serving their country in time of war. They died not in a great fleet engagement or a dramatic last stand, but in the mundane hell of damage control, fighting fires, rescuing shipmates, and trying to save a ship that was already doomed. That's the thing about naval warfare that the movies never get right. For every moment of aerial combat or dramatic ship-to-ship gunfights, there are hours of routine operations, maintenance, and the unglamorous work of keeping a complex war machine functioning in the hostile environment of the open ocean. Princeton's crew died doing that unglamorous work, and their sacrifice was just as meaningful as any pilot who shot down enemy aircraft or any gunner who sank an enemy ship. The Japanese carriersway sank that day. Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda took with them approximately 800 Japanese sailors and airmen. They also took with them Japan's ability to project naval air power across the Pacific. In strategic terms, it was a victory that shortened the war and saved thousands of American lives in future operations. When I returned home in 1946, I was asked to speak at Princeton's memorial service in Philadelphia. Standing before the families of men I had served with, trying to find words that would somehow make sense of their loss, I realized something important. Princeton's sacrifice wasn't just about one ship or one battle. It was about the price of the freedom we were fighting to preserve. Every man who died on Princeton, every sailor wounded on Birmingham, every pilot shot down over the Japanese fleet, they were all part of something larger than themselves. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the end of the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. Never again would Japanese carriers threaten American operations. Never again would Japanese naval aviation darken the skies over the Pacific. The war would continue for another 10 months, but Japan's ability to challenge American naval supremacy died with the carriers we sank off Cape Engano. Princeton was lost in flames, but her pilots kept fighting to the end. And in fighting to the end, we helped ensure that America and her allies would triumph in the greatest naval war in history. The men who died that day didn't die in vain. They died to ensure that future generations would inherit a world where freedom could flourish. That's a legacy worth dying for. That's a legacy worth remembering. And that's why, even 79 years later, we still tell the story of the USS Princeton and the men who served aboard her with such pride and such sorrow. They were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things when their country needed them most. They were heroes in the truest sense of the word, not because they sought glory, but because they did their duty even when it cost them everything. The deck was burning, but our planes were still in the fight. And in the end, that made all the difference. In memory of the 108 officers and men of USS Princeton CVL-23, who gave their lives in the service of their country, October 24, 1944,